So Matt, run us through the numbers for our third album, and then I guess it's my turn to take the reins of the car to start us off.
This is Fela Kuti in Africa 70 with Expensive Shit. And on Best Ever Albums ranking, it comes in at number 262 in the 1970s, number 19 in 1975, number 1,223 of all time, and it did make Rolling Stone's list in the top 500 at number 402. And it is, on Best Ever Albums, it is his second highest ranked album.
Gotcha. Well, this was a fascinating album. I really enjoyed this. As I was listening to this, I just kept. This is where a cold list and hot take is a interesting format for albums
for
like
two
this
tracks
because,
also.
for two. It's because it's a lot to digest for 2 tracks, and there's a lot of different stuff going on here. There's, for obvious reasons, it's a album coming out of Africa. It's got what you consider to be at the most base, and I don't mean to minimize it because I'll go into what I mean by this, but there's a clear African sound, right? But there's also like a Latin sound like all over this, which I thought was really interesting. I was also really interested in what the theme was of this album, because with the title like Expensive Shit, right? Yeah. I'm like, okay, there has to be something. And then we've touched on Fela Kuti a little bit, right, in some of the other ones, enough to know that he's in Nigeria in a tumultuous period. We also know that he sort of had a sense of propriety, right, on the area. So my gut told me as I was listening to this that there had to be some sort of political stance to this. So, guys, I cheated a ton on this one.
I'm guessing there was.
I did not cheat on the music reviews, right? So I did not want to do that, but I had to cheat on the context of what was going on. So what was happening was that Fela Kuti was a professional musician, but also was sort of a political statesman kind of. It sounded a little bit like kind of the Bob Marley role, right? But a little bit more overtly plugged into like actually doing political acts, as opposed to being the spokesman for a generation. Does that make sense? Kind of. Yeah. So he apparently had been sort of targeted by the rulers of Nigeria in this case, and Lagos in specific, and so how the story goes is that cops planted marijuana on him, and I guess they were coming to arrest him, but Kuti was able to swallow the marijuana, and he kind of just then, like it was this really interesting story, and he basically, the long and the short of it, guys, is that he swallows this marijuana, okay, and then to destroy the evidence. And so then he's held by the authorities while they're waiting for him to like crap it out, right? To have the evidence that this happened, right? So, but while this was happening, it never came out, right? Hence the idea, he called it Expensive Shit. I'm not making that up, by the way. That is the thing. But like, it's also a larger thing because there's a context, you know what I mean, of, where money was going, right, with the rulers, and they weren't being seen by other people. So there's another layer to this. So that's a little bit of like the context. There's a lot more, and I kind of went down a rabbit hole, right, about what like Nigeria was like in the mid 70s because I was kind of fascinated. But let's talk. We're a music podcast though, so let's talk a little bit about how like I heard this. The drums are really interesting. It's funky. It's a really funky album, and one thing that stood out to me, guys, is how much we've listened to quite a few funk albums, and I was amazed actually how much this sounded like a funk album, but just coming at it from a different direction. Does that make sense as to what I'm saying?
Yes. Yep.
Right. Yeah. And so, and Kuti's got this really interesting voice that's passionate, even if you're not 100% sure what he's talking about, especially on Water No Get Enemy, which is just, there's these big beats right all over it, and then Kuti is singing sort of in a percussive way, and then this keyboard is all over it too, which makes it a really interesting. I don't know, is it keyboard or is it that like electric piano? Because I couldn't tell if it was the same thing just being played differently or if they were both there. But needless to say, there's brass instruments all over this. Yeah, it's really cool, and I'm gonna kind of come back to it. I don't want to overtalk my piece of it, but I really like this album, and I'd love to hear it again in a different context. Where I was kind of earmarking specific things that I remember from the first time I listened to it, and going back and digging through almost like I do on a jazz album. So, but Josh, what do you think? I'm curious to hear both you guys take.
Yeah, I thought it sounded similar to like the Brazilian music that we've talked about.
Yeah.
So I think it's drawn on that too. When you say it's got the Latin influence, I mean, Brazil's not really Latin America, but
well, I don't know if it's influenced, but it sounds Latin. Yeah, I don't know if he was influenced or just was the overlap.
Yeah, this album's got this great energy to it. I like the fact that there's like this constant beat in the background throughout the entire thing. It's the same beat too, but then they're adding stuff on top of it, and the things like the horns. I picture him like running around on stage and stuff, performing or like playing different instruments, even though I think there's just a bunch of musicians playing. But it's got that kind of energy where like you want to move to it, but then there's a lot going on and to take in too. It's almost like a combination of like jazz, like Afro jazz almost, or something, or like this like or maybe like Afro funk too. It's not as like it's not as like bass heavy as some of the funk we've heard, or I don't think of it that way. It's more like danceable, although the funk's danceable too. I don't know. There's just like it's lighter, I guess, in tone than some of the funk that we've heard. I think that's how I would describe it. There's no vocals for a lot of the time too on this track. He comes in late, like about 6 minutes in on the first track, Expensive Shit, and then you just get other instrumentation and on the second track, like a repeating like chorus of people singing Water Get No Get Enemy, or something about water. I only listened to this once. This would be an album to listen to again for sure. But yeah, I like the feel of it. I like the energy of it, and and the album cover is, I mean, definitely commenting on something. It's a bunch of African women giving the Black Power symbol topless behind barbed wire. So that's like, I think that plays into the themes of what he was, and they're smiling. So it's like this contrast of a lot of different things going on in the album.
Yeah, I was getting I like this as well. I was getting more of a reminded of listening to the jazz records that we have, and I don't. It's kind of weird. Like it's got certain elements of that. I definitely heard the funk as well, but I just liked a lot of the tone, like the guitar. A lot of the guitars that were being played was it was in the background, but I just thought that they were very crisp, clear tones that I liked. And then there's lots of horns as well. So there was just something about it that I was just feeling like this seems like an improv jazz type sound that I was getting. And, kind of comparing it to some of the other stuff, more accessible than the stuff that we've listened to already. The kind of the Miles Davis electric stuff, for example, or even some of the Coltrane stuff. I think that this is more accessible, and maybe it's because of the production of the tones, or maybe it's just because of the beats that are in the background that are there. But you're right, it's not as, I agree that it's not as predominant or like as upfront. There's other stuff going on, and the rhythm is a little bit to the back, but it still is consistent throughout the songs. And lots of like bongos and like, not like drum kits or anything like that. It's like bongos and like those sticks that you're banging together, and just these like a little bit more primitive, if you will, percussion instruments, basic percussion instruments. But hard to kind of like, because again, it's not stuff that I listen to typically, but and only one listen, and you're kind of just like, wow, I like this, and it's kind of,
right.
It doesn't. I don't mind the fact that the songs are on the long side. I kind of think that this is one of the types of songs that should be long, kind of give you some time to digest it, take it in. And, they vary it up a little bit. Like you're right with the vocals, which at times I was like, sometimes they're speaking English and sometimes I don't know what they're speaking, but
it's like pigeon English, right? Where it's like, that's kind of like an African thing, right? It's like the native language is a native African language, but also English, which is like kind of, there's a lot of countries in Africa like that, right? Like Kenya, Nigeria, places where like technically the language is English, but then it's like a version that's like a hybrid of, just like there's Pidgin Spanish, right, at different places. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and some of the vocals were almost like it was some maybe call and response or like chanting in a way. It's like, I don't know, like a mantra or whatever, but it was, I liked it. It's, it's definitely different. I thought the Water Catch No Get Enemy at the beginning of that, there's like a horn part there that sounds like the beginning of the Odd Couple theme song, which I was like, it kind of sounds like the Odd Couple. But I don't know. It's interesting. I probably would like to listen to it again to be able to say more about it. But I definitely, it was a fun listen. It was an easy listen too. I didn't really have to, expand myself too much. It kind of hit me, as it was, and I liked it.
Yeah, definitely something that would be wonderful to see live too. I get the feeling this music is made to see live in the same way that
I would agree with that.
The blues album was.
Well, yeah, you could just see these guys playing this stuff and having a blast, and like getting the crowd into it and everybody dancing and calling back and stuff. So no, I agree with that.
Well, and he's a very significant figure in contemporary Nigerian history too. So it's almost as much his music is an outgrowth to some degree of the time and the place of Nigeria. I remember all the way back, Matt, when you talk about Ushmitantes and they sort of blended being in the political realm with also doing music that was revolutionary, and I feel like he operates a similar space. And we said Marley, he kind of is in that space as well, where his story is fascinating. He's also a very complicated guy in that like he's very, very right on some issues and like very, very wrong on other issues, in terms of how history would judge you, right? But most of them he's right on, but he had a couple, he had an interesting end of his life thing with like AIDS denialism, right? Which is a little inconvenient, but he also was always pretty much on the right side of human rights and stuff, and was a legitimate voice for the voiceless. And he was always at odds with any of the dictatorships that were in Nigeria. And he almost died on a raid at a compound. So I don't mean to go, I love history, as you guys know, but I think in this case, it's appropriate though, because I heard it in the lyrics a little bit and the sound of the album. And, even the title refers to something, but musically, I loved it. It was eclectic. They're two longer songs, but how can you even do this style of music and the derivations without going long? So to me, it's a different framework than a pop album or a rock and roll album. So kind of like the blues, right? Like you can't write a 3-minute blues song. To have a good blues song, it's got to be like 6 or 7 minutes minimum. But then there's
I don't know about that. You think so? Why can't you do a blues song? It can be. We just listened to Muddy Waters. They weren't all 7-minute songs.
Yeah, the best blues songs I think of as live. Once again, I go back to live, right?
Okay.
Like, even if your song is 3 or 4 minutes on an album, is anybody ever going to play that blues song in a live form?
That's true.
Your standards. So I guess that's what I'm getting. Yeah, can Fish make 3.5-minute songs, or the Grateful Dead? Like, are they going to play them for 3.5 minutes at a concert? Not the ones that the people there want to hear.
Yeah.
So. Yeah, so does that help to add?
Yeah, no, I see what you're saying. Yeah. And the interesting thing too is like when I was talking about, this is his second highest rated album. That's actually his second highest rated with the band Africa 70, because he has solo albums as well, just with him, just accredited to him. And then he also has albums with Africa 70 and Ginger Baker.
So they did some
Ginger
Baker.
I also
Baker,
think
this Nigeria thing's kind of keeps cropping up here.
Well, I also think it's interesting that like when 1980 hit, he renamed his band Egypt 80, which was interesting. So he understood, the change of the decade signaled new things. But yeah, so Absolutely. But yeah, I would recommend this one. This was really enjoyable. And this is another one that I would love to have folks more familiar with it. In the cold listen hot take, I sometimes feel like we're catching up on some of the context because we're only listening to it once. And this is where I'd love some folks that are familiar with the narrative or familiar with the music to add extra color. So love to hear from you on the YouTube page when we post this, or just in, communistx@gmail.com. With feedback as well, or just if you listen to this album, if you have or you do and you want to point stuff up too on any of these albums, we'd love to hear from you.
Or is Fela Kuti like the Michael Jordan in Nigeria or something? Is he like super famous and everyone knows who he is?
I don't know if Michael Jordan would be who I'd be. It's like he seemed to kind of carry an interesting role where he was critical of European and American influence on Africa, like the exploitative influence, but he was equally critical of, I guess, what you consider to be, in his mind, the Western-backed governments of his own countrymen, right? So he's going back and forth between like challenging the native, even the independent governments, right? Where there's independent, he kind of is speaking out against what he would consider to be corrupt governments or dictatorial governments, but also very steady drumbeat about the effect of, Europe and United States, both lineage-wise, cultural lineage, as well as in their role in the world. Like from what I understand, in the 80s, he was like writing songs about like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, right, to give you an idea, because obviously they represented, I guess, the 80s, right, more than any two political figures.
Yeah.
The West, so
okay,
got it.